We have put in so much entitlement into our government that we really have spoiled our citizenry and said, you don't want the jobs that are available.
Her fellow Nevada Republican, Congressman Dean Heller, recently warned that unemployment benefits may be creating a nation of hobos. He actually used the word hobos. And it's not just Republican candidates or Republican congressmen up for re-election. This attacking the unemployed thing is also being pushed by Republican leaders in Congress.
You know, we should not be giving cash to people who basically are just going to go blow it on drugs.
That doesn't create new jobs. In fact, if anything, continuing to pay people unemployment compensation is a disincentive for them to seek new work.
The Republican Party appears poised to contest the elections this year on the basis of, hey, unemployed guy, we hate you.
This is a temporary extension. It's over $10 billion. And all Senator Bunning was saying, quite correctly, is it ought to be paid for.
Republican Senator John Kyle of Arizona adding to his argument that unemployed people just don't want to get jobs. His conviction that any benefits for unemployed people can't be added to the deficit. They must, as he said, be paid for.
How are you going to pay the $678 billion just on the tax cuts for people making more than $200,000 a year?
You should never raise taxes in order to cut taxes. Surely, Congress has the authority, and it would be right to, if we decide we want to cut taxes to spur the economy, not to have to raise taxes in order to offset those costs. You do need to offset the cost of increased spending, and that's what Republicans object to. But you should never have to offset the cost of a deliberate decision to reduce tax rates on Americans.
Ta-da! Remember, John Kyle is one of the Republicans blocking unemployment benefits for people who've lost their jobs because that can't be added to the deficit. But nearly $700 billion of tax cuts that benefit people who make more than $200,000 a year? Tax cuts for rich people? Those, go ahead and add them to the deficit. According to even the conservative economist Mark Zandi, here's how it works. Every buck that the government spends on an across-the-board tax cut creates $1.02 in economic activity. Not very much bang for that buck. Every dollar the government spends on unemployment benefits, on the other hand, creates $1.63 in economic activity. That money is spent. It goes right back into the economy. It makes sense. You're giving money to people who are broke and don't have jobs and desperately need money. They need to be able to spend that money. It goes into the economy, it drives demand, it helps the whole country's economy. Tax cuts help a tiny little bit, but nowhere near as much.
And what is so politically damaging about what Kyle did today is he showed it to be the latter. He said, actually, we're only worried about the deficit when it's something Democrats want to do. When it is our principles on the line, you know what? It's actually not that big of a deal. As a matter of principle, we don't need to worry about the deficit.
Last question for you. There does seem to be a disconnect between national politicians and state politicians on this. Governors across the country just held their conference up in Boston, and Pat Quinn from Illinois said up there, quote, "I'm disappointed in Washington. We can't have Herbert Hoover economics coming out of some of the members of Congress. They don't understand how you fight a recession. The federal government has to run a deficit in recessionary times because we've got to get out of the ditch." Explaining some of what you just explained here. But why is it that governors get this, but not national Democrats?
Because budgets to them aren't matters of philosophy. Look, state budgets in 2010 are looking at a $200 billion shortfall. In 2011, a $180 billion shortfall. That is a massive anti-stimulus. That is contraction in the economy. And they know what happens if they can't fund that. They can't run a deficit. States 49 of 50, the exception being Vermont, cannot run deficits constitutionally. So if they have to cut, what they do is they fire teachers, they let go of Medicaid, and when that happens, their states go further into recession because people aren't spending money that they're now not getting, and then their economies get harder, they don't have revenues, deficits are larger. This is a terrible cycle, and the people who can interrupt it are the federal government. It can step into the middle, run a deficit, and pull people up. But if we have a sort of a minority party that won't allow us to step into that gap, we're going to be in real trouble here.